This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Assata Taught Me, State Violence, Racial Capitalism, and the Movement for Black Lives by Donna Murch. Drawing its title from one of America's foremost revolutionaries, this collection of thought-provoking essays by award-winning Black Panther Party scholar Donna Murch explores how social protest is challenging our current system of state violence and mass incarceration, exploring how a youth-led political movement has emerged in recent years to challenge the bipartisan consensus on punishment, and looking to the future through a redistributive, queer, and feminist lens. As Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor puts it, Donna Murch is one of the sharpest, most incisive, and elegant writers on racism, radicalism, and struggle today. This is a smart and sophisticated book that should be read and studied by everyone in search of answers to the profound crises that continue to confront this country. Find Assata Taught Me at haymarketbooks.org, where readers in the US and UK receive free shipping on orders over $25 and £20, respectively. Assata Taught Me, State Violence, Racial Capitalism, and the Movement for Black Lives by Donna Murch. Out now from Haymarket Books. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. You likely know that the United States incarcerates a world historic number of people. But what role does mass incarceration play in American political economy? Why did the prison industrial complex emerge when it did? Why did it, like border militarization, rise out of the order-shaking crises of the 1970s alongside neoliberal globalization? What to make of what my guest today, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, calls the, quote, deepening divide between the hypermobile and the friction-fixed? And what, in turn, does that all reveal about what sort of politics are required to overcome it all? Ruth Wilson Gilmore is, of course, the leading abolitionist scholar of the prison industrial complex. Today, I'm interviewing Ruthie alongside two brilliant scholars who edited Abolition Geography, Essays Towards Liberation, a new volume of Ruthie's work, Alberto Toscano and Brenna Bhandar. I know The Dig is a long podcast, but I really wish this interview could have been even longer. I didn't have time to ask even half my questions. It's a really fascinating conversation, a conversation that I had days before a gunman in Texas massacred children and their teachers. A horrific event that is part and parcel of an American infrastructure and culture of armed violence that is not curtailed by police, but rather extends from the police, military, and border patrol through the gun shows selling AR-15s, the weapons company stocks that rise after every mass shooting, and the Republican campaign ads featuring candidates locked and loaded, ready to open fire against a coming woke apocalypse of open borders and child groomers. If you appreciate these conversations, please support The Dig. The reason these interviews are so in-depth is because your support allows me to do this for my full-time job and to pay everyone who helps out. And so I spend just an extraordinary amount of time preparing for each and every interview. The way that you can support The Dig is at patreon.com/thedig. For those of you who don't know, it's like a monthly subscription service. You donate $1, $5, $20 a month, whatever works for you. Everything helps a lot. Many podcasts paywall half their episodes so that you support them, which I get. And I know that I would have a lot more Patreon supporters if I did that. But it's really important to us that everyone be able to listen to everything we put out, regardless of your ability to pay. And so if you can afford to contribute, if you are a Dig listener who really wouldn't miss $5 a month in your bank account, I sincerely ask you to donate now. Plus, a donation of any amount at all gets you access to our weekly newsletter. It's excellent, sent directly to your email inbox. Donate $10 or more a month, and we will send you a book or books in the mail, or a Dig tote bag or Dig mug. That's patreon.com/thedig. I really do appreciate it. Also, we have a really gorgeous new Dig website at thedigradio.com. It's really nice looking. It has all of our archives, all 350 episodes or so, organized by topic and by guest. If you ever run out of digs to listen to, please check out the website. We also, on our new website, have a growing number of transcripts of Dig episodes and all of our weekly newsletters. Okay, here's Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Alberto Toscano, and Brenna Bhandar. Brenna Bhandar lives and works as a law professor on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. She is the author of Colonial Lives of Property, Law, Land, and Racial Regimes of Ownership, and co-editor of Revolutionary Feminisms, Conversations on Collective Action and Radical Thought. Alberto Toscano teaches at the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University and is the co-director of the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought at Goldsmiths at the University of London. He is the author of Fanaticism on the Use of an Idea and co-editor of the Sage Handbook of Marxism. He is currently completing a book on fascism. Ruth Wilson Gilmore organizes with people around the planet, teaches at the City University of New York Graduate Center, and is the author of Abolition Geography, which is edited by Brenna and Alberto, Golden Gulag, and, out this fall, Change Everything. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Alberto Toscano, and Brenna Bhandar, welcome to The Dig.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks.
To start out, a pretty basic question, but an important one. What is the prison industrial complex? And why is that concept a useful one for thinking about the American carceral state?
You know, it never crossed my mind that would be the first question you asked. But let me take a stab at answering it. The idea for conceptualizing what we have come to describe as mass incarceration, using the term prison industrial complex, first kind of materialized in an article that Mike Davis published about 20 years ago, I think in The Nation. And what Mike launched into our consciousness was a provocation to think about prison punishment, the carceral, in as an expansive a way as we had learned to think about the military-industrial complex. And while a number of people over the years have written about what that complex consists of, I think I probably have written the most, or at least gone on at the most length, in part because as an old PhD student, I studied the military-industrial complex to shreds at the seminar table of the economist and socialist Anne Markison. So the prison industrial complex consists of the uniformed and civilian personnel who work anywhere from the streets to the courts to the jails to the prisons to the post-prison release programs and so forth. It includes the boosters in the towns where prisons and jails are built, or neighborhoods. It includes the intellectuals, including myself, who make their living either designing or condemning the design of systems of punishment. It includes the finance capitalists who lend money to states and municipalities to build or improve their lockup systems. It includes the various firms that sell all kinds of goods and services to, again, states and municipalities, including the federal government, in order to keep people locked up or to keep them under surveillance when they're not locked up. So that can be anything from food service to ankle monitors, anything in between. All of that put together is the prison industrial complex. Most of the dollars that flow through it originate from public treasuries, and they fall into the hands of people in the forms of wages, salaries, utility bills, and the kinds of things that it takes to keep the lights on overhead, interest payments to bondholders who have lent money to governments to build these kinds of facilities, even though those same lenders, many of which are pension plans, might have lent money to governments to build schools or parks or museums or dams or highways.
Alberto?
Well, I suppose the only thing maybe that would be worth mentioning or reflecting on for me at this point, and I have very little to add to the detail of Ruthie's analysis, is perhaps the way in which a certain focus on the prison or a certain focus on incarceration and criminalization can very much occlude or make disappear all of the institutions, mediations, agents, and agencies that Ruthie's just mapped. And something we deal with a little bit in the introduction, I think the proposal to put the prison in this expanded sense at the center of rethinking or reconceptualization of state building and state capacities and struggles of the states, especially in the United States, but elsewhere as well, can and has or is very easily misunderstood as focusing on the prison as the singular architectural and punishment site for the imprisonment of hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S., but also in other contexts. And I guess the dialectical proposition that we both found very worthwhile to engage with in Ruthie's work is precisely that that single-minded focus on the prison in isolation from all of those mediations is perhaps one of the best way of not thinking how mass incarceration operates and what its role in the broader political economy is. It's a kind of reminder for me of that great line that Bertolt Brecht borrowed about the photograph of the Krupp or AEG works, the military, in fact, industrial complex of early 20th century Germany, doesn't tell you anything about the social relations that make it possible, right? And our culture is suffused, right, with fetishistic and horrifying and at times well-intentioned images of prisons that totally disappear everything that Ruthie's talking about in this book and everything that she's been involved in her activism, I think.
Brenna?
For me, the way that Ruthie's elaborated this concept of, or this term, the prison industrial complex, becomes a way of thinking about global capitalism. It becomes a kind of method, maybe a method of inquiry. And so in the way that she just a few moments ago broke down or kind of excavated what is congealed in this thing called the prison industrial complex is a way, for me, it's a way of thinking and a way of seeing that is enormously helpful in understanding how we can map and think about something that otherwise seems completely overwhelming, totalizing. So I think that, and we can get into the dialectical aspects of Ruthie's elaboration of the prison industrial complex further into our conversation, but it really strikes me when she includes herself, in the class of people, intellectuals, organizers, etc., who are also part of this prison industrial complex, in the sense that, it reminded me, it recalls Cedric Robinson's thinking about how dialectics operate in the Constitution of something that comes to look really solid and totalizing and absolute, which is that, this dialectic that's involved in the creation of these things, involve resistance and involve contradiction, right? And that often, I think, gets lost. So anyways, yeah, that those were some of the things that came to mind in listening to Ruthie speak. And it's, even having sort of read your work, Ruthie, for a long time now, and reread and thought about it and talked to you so much, I still find myself taking notes when you speak. So, which for me is really also, another aspect, we can get into this more as well in the conversation, is how dynamic and fluid this way of thinking is. And so that there's something very alive in these conversations, even if we are bringing up similar themes repeatedly, that there is there's a movement that's a part of thinking in this way that I find really generative.
I imagine many listeners will be taking notes as well. Ruthie, there's also, though, this more narrow popular reading of the term prison industrial complex that emphasizes private prisons and a cruder sense of the profit motive. What do we miss about the political economy of the carceral state when we see it as the product simply of corporate greed for profits?
It's a shame that prison industrial complex has atrophied in the way that it has. In the 90s, as organizations and, as it were, the rudiments of social movements started to arise, people grasped the term thinking this is telling us something that we hadn't thought about before, that we should think about. But the tendency has been to narrow to some notion of, as you said, Daniel, private prisons and corporate greed. Now, empirically, which is to say for listeners, if you just counted up who's in prison, who runs that prison, who benefits from that prison, we'll find that private prisons are a minimal part of the entire thing in the United States, quite different in the UK, but we can talk about that. And the problem that I have faced with a lot of people, and in fact debated with some very well-known people, has been around the question of whether thinking about private prisons might be the gateway for people to think about capitalism. And my conclusion after more than 20 years of trying to do that is it's not the gateway. That private prisons are a particular thing, a particular form of parasite capitalism. They really do exist. They don't drive the system. The cause of the system, they are not the system's destiny. That in many parts of the world and in many parts of the United States, the prison and jail system can be wholly public, and it's no less deadly for the people locked up, for the communities, than places where part of the system has been contracted out to private companies. But let me take this discussion in a slightly different direction, encouraged as I am by what Alberto and Brenna were talking about. And that is, if we think about the prison industrial complex and all of the things that I've just enumerated, and think about them in terms of contradiction, as both Alberto and Brenna remind us we must, then we can kind of move to another level of generalization or abstraction and say, well, what are the fundamental things that the prison industrial complex is made of? What are the fundamental things? Land, labor, money capital, and the state's capacity to organize these things. That way of thinking, I think, gives us an entry into thinking about racial capitalism, the capitalist state, what happens when labor is surplus, what has happened to the composition of public sector workers, what has happened to the churn of money capital through the public sector over time. There are so many questions that we can then turn our attention to that might give us some stronger indication of where and how to fight. Because the only purpose of doing any of this analysis at all is figuring out where and how to fight. To go back to the private prison issue for a moment, if getting rid of private prison contracts were the pathway to dismantling and dissolving the system, it would have already happened in places like the state of Tennessee or in immigrant detention because of the huge win in dismissing the contract for a private immigrant detention center in Hutto, Texas, or some recent positive outcomes in the Pacific Northwest around private immigrant detention contracts. However, nothing changes other than the contract, which gives us some insight into where perhaps fighting is energetically engaged in without resulting in what we want, which is people not locked up.
I think almost following what Ruthie was saying and thinking back also about the first time I read Golden Gulag, most of which was actually in a flight to Los Angeles appropriately, but that in a way where the image that transpires, especially from that work, is of what somewhat churlishly one could call it prison deindustrialization complex, right? And I think one of the things that I found really striking in this kind of Gestalt switch perception that happens when you read theory that works was the way in which that book actually allowed me to rethink about what exactly deindustrialization might mean, right? So in some sense, the notion of the prison and the military industrial complex is suffused with a post-war notion of what the economy is, and also a post-war notion of what profits are. And what really emerges from Golden Gulag and from the connected essays and articles published in Abolition Geography is a way of reading and seeing and acting in the geography of that deindustrialization, especially in the context of California, and actually making something palpable as a site of state and capital strategies, but also as a site of organizing, which is usually entirely neglected by 99.9 repeating percent of liberals and many Marxists as well, which is the whole dimension of what Ruthie, borrowing from, is it Terry McGee is the name of the geographer? The Desakota, the neither urban nor rural. Or even thinking of Phil Neal's book on hinterlands, right? That whole dimension as a space that's not just the left behind, right? It's not just a forgotten space. It's a space that's deeply significant for all of these moves and reconfigurations of political economies and state strategies and everyday, livelihoods. And I found that very powerful because I think there is a very static way of thinking about processes of urbanization and then of kind of surplusing of what used to be the rural and is now some kind of unthinkable wasteland populated by, scary voters for reactionary projects. But the image that transpires is a very different one. So I think in that sense, actually, and maybe this is continuing the earlier question about what an expansive notion of prison industrial complex may allow one to think, it actually makes visible as sites of theory and struggle also domains that go well above and beyond thinking just about incarceration, right? And I think can be a starting point also for other, for actually thinking, well, what is the shape of, contemporary agricultural labor. Those are also things that one learns about through reading Ruthie's work. And so I find that element, which is very much in contradistinction to the centering on the prison, and certainly the centering on the private prison, to be very significant.
I want to spell out some of this history we've been alluding to more concretely. Ruthie, you wrote that the prison industrial complex is an attempt to fix, quote, major problems that appear materially and ideologically as surpluses of finance capital, land, labor, and state capacity that have accumulated from a series of overlapping and interlocking crises, stretching across 3 decades. What is the relationship between crisis and surplus, and how did the capitalist crises of the 1970s create these surpluses in particular? And then how did the prison industrial complex and what you call the anti-state state arise in an attempt to reconcile or fix these crises?
Simplest way that I can present crisis and surplus to our listeners is to think that when a system goes into crisis, it means that it can't get through to its next day or its next round of whatever that it used to do. And that means, however, that the crisis, its inability to make its next round, whether it's the next round of reproductive life in the home or next round of production in the factory or the field, or its next round of extensive and wonderful public education for children from age tiny to PhD, then all kinds of things, money things, human energy, tools, equipment, buildings, become, as it were, left aside, surplused. And that surplus means that people's time is no longer needed within the formerly existing social system. I am not saying that what existed was necessarily just or good. I am saying the change means that the energy no longer is needed. That money capital that might have flowed through those systems in order to be paid out as wages or as rents or as, again, overhead utilities for durable equipment, for food, no longer circulates in the same way. So these are some examples of surplus. Another example that I studied rather to shreds many years ago was a number of shifts in the use formerly irrigated agricultural land in California. Now, obviously, not all agricultural land everywhere has experienced the same level of capital investment and improvement as land in the dry west of the United States, but that is another example. It could be coal mines in Kentucky, for quite a different example. So we have surplus, which is to say all kinds of factors of production have been idled, set aside. Money surplus is perhaps the strangest one because people listening think, well, wait a second, if there's enough money, why did all of this happen? And the answer, of course, brings us to some crude but accurate view into capitalism and the way that money must circulate according to the particular goals of those who own or control the money capital, and money circulating in the form of the social wage through the state depends on a certain, let's call it legitimacy, that's determined by any number of social actors, but certainly not by popular democratic agreement. That then, this churn of unused or idle labor, land, money capital throws already existing institutions deeper into crisis, where, for example, as happened in the United States, a tax revolt on the part of large banks and corporations did an enormous amount of work in making poor one of the richest political economies in the history of the world, and that was California. But it was artificially made poor because the large banks and corporations could decide to pay lower taxes. And what does that mean? It meant that they could compose a legislative body and cause to be elected a governor who would pursue those goals on behalf of those capitalist firms. That then left the state, in this case, the state of California, with all kinds of bureaucratic and fiscal capacities. It could borrow money, spend money, make things, hire people, train people, you name it. Had all these capacities, but did not have the legitimacy to put those energies, those organizational and human energies, toward the kinds of purposes that what we used to call the welfare state, however weak, was put.
Are the people who end up getting locked up disproportionately surplus populations as well?
Well, they'd have to be, because if they weren't surplus, somebody would have them working for them. Look, my favorite astonishing number that I've repeated for some time, so it's probably bigger now than it was, is that in the United States of America, the labor force, the workforce, is probably about 160 million people. Of that labor force, more than half are carrying some kind of disqualifying arrest or conviction record, whether or not they've ever been locked up. I mean, it's really quite an astonishing thing. And of course, those records, those disqualifying records that people, modestly educated people in the prime of life carry, disqualify them from certain kinds of jobs, which means that if they manage to get work, they are like gig employees, highly vulnerable to any fluctuation in the workplace or the market. They're very easy to dismiss. Very, very easy. So there's been a whole movement that's grown over the last 20 years, organized and led by people who were formerly incarcerated, or as we say nowadays, justice impacted, whether or not incarcerated, to quote unquote ban the box, which is to say to get rid of the questions on employment applications that say, have you ever been arrested? The surplusing of people, surplus population, is a kind of thorny category to think about, because for many who try genuinely to understand how racial capitalism works in the United States, the idea of somebody being deprived of their freedom and either ankle shackled at home with a monitor or locked up in a jail or prison must somehow, for people, lead to a necessity that those unfree people's labor be exploited, because otherwise, why bother? And the why bother, again, based in empirical reckonings of who actually does what, among the 2.3 million people locked up at any given moment in the United States, is that, in fact, labor exploitation explains virtually nothing. And many people righteously believe, and I used to, a long time ago, righteously presume that somehow continuation of unfreedom must mean a continuation of slavery, which must mean a continuation of labor exploitation. It's different. There is exploitation. It's not labor. What turns into money that circulates as wages and interest and rent and utility bills and so forth is time. The people who are locked up are deprived of time, which is to say, time is extracted from their lives. They never get it back. Nobody ever gets their time back. And it's the fact of time that becomes transformed into money that circulates in these various ways. That time becomes money. And if you think back on everything that anybody has ever written to analyze the peculiar condition that capitalism throws entire polities and political economies into, we're reminded that Marx talked about the annihilation of space by time, and that's what happens to people who are imprisoned one by one by one. We are space, and our space, our lives, are annihilated by the extraction of time.
Ruthie, you write, quote, "If economics lies at the base of the prison system, its growth is a function of politics, not mechanics." Brenna and Alberto, why is it the economic foundation of the prison system that exposes its fundamental political contingency?
Quotation reminds me of the idea of the Clausewitzian and then the reversals of the Clausewitzian, politics as a continuation of war by other means, and how we can think about warfare in not a Clausewitzian sense, but maybe warfare as class war or race war, these other conceptions of war as being a continuation of politics by other means. And I was, reminded of that formulation by the quotation, because in both frameworks, we're thinking about what the material operation of a thing kind of exposes about its own motor force, if that makes sense, And yeah, I wanted to go back, before Alberto answers, I wanted to go back and ask Ruthie, in terms of this idea of time becoming money and the extractivist nature of the PIC in terms of prisoners is the extraction of time that they never get back. If there's also, in that transmutation of time into money, if there's some element of speculation involved in that or not. But yeah, I wanted to raise that.
That's a really interesting question. I have to think about it. And I mean, my gut tells me yes, but those who are speculating are not, as our listeners might imagine, finger-rubbing venture capitalists who are trying to figure out how to make $1 into $2. Rather, I think a lot of the speculation happens, again, in the context of already existing institutions of the state, where people struggling to maintain the agencies that they work in turn to what has over time, over these last 30 or 40 years, become apparently the most politically justifiable growth area of the state, and say, we do this too. That's, I think, where the speculation is. We need more officers in the schools because we do this too. Or one of my favorite examples, the United States Department of Education has a SWAT team, so they can come and break down your front door if they suspect that you are engaging in student loan fraud. A SWAT team. So there's that kind of speculation of a certain kind of need, as well as speculating that more and more people across the life cycle will necessarily require inhibition, prohibition, punishment in order for any social agency to do what it's supposed to do, whether it's dispense food or education, or, as happened in Chicago the other day, the mayor has closed the most elaborate and fancy park in the city of Chicago to teenagers. So, of course, that makes all of those teenagers available for the work of being policed. And then the police then speculate on what more they can do to build their section of the budget. And indeed, what we see in terms of mission absorption and mission imitation, not only do agencies whose job it is to provide the basic goods of life, education, housing, and so forth, incorporate into their mission policing, exclusion, and punishment, but also in an effort to resist and turn back the constant criticism and argument that many, not so much abolitionists as abolition adjacent people, have made about education, not incarceration, so forth, is that police and jails and prisons are saying, oh, well, give us more money and we will do all of that too. We can do everything. So there is a lot of speculation that's attached to the actual extraction of time or the potential identification of people whose time can then become extractable.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just really fascinating because we start with something that's actually quite counterintuitive. And I was thinking of the analogy of property in my head, which, is problematic, but also it's analogous in some ways in the sense that there's something very counterintuitive about the idea that you lock up people and extract time, even though there's the appearance of a kind of non-productivity, right? So there's this counterintuitive thing that is then taken to these really perverse but logical, conclusions in a way. And the other element of what you just mapped is that it's limitless in a way, or it has the appearance of being limitless when you map all of the different realms into which the speculation is taken and how it operates. So I think, anyway.
I think we do tend, not just in talking about prisons or incarceration, but in general, still to operate with a kind of, I don't know if it's a 19th century sort of antinomy, but where, the world of economics is a world of some kind of anonymous, hydraulic functionality, and then the world of politics is a world of a sovereign, generally masculine decision. The peculiar aspect of this geographical and kind of historical phenomenology of prisons that Ruthie's presenting is that actually the domains of taxations, of budgets, of competition between different agencies, indeed different police forces, right? All of whom, for instance, in the vicinity of St. Louis are trying to arrest the same African-American drivers as they move through all of these underfunded, so to speak, police jurisdictions who are dependent, right, for their own existence on juridically extracting monetary value out of racialized subjects. But in that case, for instance, the intentionality cannot be thought of simply as an intentionality of a cognitively or psychologically racist police force, though they very well might be that too. But it's also a compulsion, right? It's a compulsion that puts the politics into the economics. And I think that, so I think one of the things that we're challenged to do by looking with the empirical and methodological care that Ruthie does at the deployment, right, of the PAC and so on, is to rethink that relationship, right, where economics is not some macro level of the US GDP and class structure, and politics is what elite politicians decide at any given point or what a set of ideologues think. But which might set some boundary conditions for this, which of course matter as state and federal policy matters, but also very much politics at this, if not micro, at least meso level, right? Where people are indeed compelled by the political economy of the institutions of which they're part to engage, they're channeled, at least in certain types of behaviors, which also explains why, a purely kind of cognitive or psychological effort to roll back the racist proclivities of, individual members of the repressive state apparatus might not get you very far, because the police department fully, manned by black cops in one of those jurisdictions will have just the same compulsion in order to maintain their jobs to continue arresting, modestly educated working people in their area, right? And that's what we'll obtain. So I think we need to, when we think of politics vis-a-vis economics, it shouldn't be, right? I mean, it's really thinking about political economy, to be a little bit trad, and I think political economy as its constant critique, right? Not as some domain of objectivity that then allows us to map why people behave in certain ways despite their intentions.
I was just thinking to follow up on what Alberto was just saying, and the terrific question that Brenna had put to me that I've been thinking about more than I realized. But once you put it to me, I was like, oh, I have been thinking about that. And that is to think about territories, and thinking territory as it were, the fundamental condition of what we understand to be states, that states have this territorial jurisdiction, but also to pick up on a word that Alberto used, sovereignty, and the kind of liberal notion. I'm not embracing this, but I do want to point out its importance to what we're talking about. The liberal notion of the sovereign individual who then allegedly has domain over the territory of herself. And it's exactly the evacuation or the cancellation of that sovereignty for part or all of their lives, which is what makes people who are criminalized, again, whether or not incarcerated, vulnerable to time extraction. It's the end of sovereignty. It's sovereignty-less. Sovereignty. I don't know. You're going to have to figure out what that word is and put in for me. They're not people who are lacking sovereigns. They're people who do not have sovereignty. At the same time, to go back to states are, of course, complex and contradictory sets of institutions. They are subjects and objects of struggle, etc. They're all of this. Certain arms of the state, especially the forces of organized violence, police and military, have in the U.S. context and perhaps everywhere that we are able to think about, a sense of their own sovereign right to inflict harm or extract freedom, which is to say, take time from people, in their domain. So there are, all these petty sovereigns, as it were, who get to do what they do. And I came across this really great phrase of the late, great Joan Didion's, who in writing about, I think maybe it's in her writing on El Salvador, talks about the inconsolable anger on the part of the forces of organized violence when they encounter pushback, right? Political, cultural criticism of the things that they do. And I think that this is really true in the United States today, that the level and density of police organization and the unabashed promotion of policing and organized violence on the part of people who, having worked their way up through police forces, are now the heads of municipal states. Lori Lightfoot in Chicago, Eric Adams in New York, and so forth. I'm constantly repeating what I can only see as their inconsolable anger that their having become cops was not enough for all of us who criticized them. And they then deploy more cop work. They are insisting, like an absolutist monarch of the 18th century, that they must be respected and that the way they will get the respect they need is to do whatever bodily reconfiguration of your person that they and their forces of organized violence wish to do. That's where I think we are.
What you say brings to mind just this visceral attachment to police and anger over any sort of questioning of the legitimacy of police authority that makes Blue Lives Matter so core to today's right-wing politics. Ruthie, riffing off Stuart Hall, you write, quote, "Race is a modality through which political economic globalization is lived." So mass incarceration, this ultimate fixing of certain people in place in really large numbers, is key to understanding the forms of capitalism that we've seen ascendant since the 1970s or so. Similarly, so we've seen the same thing with the hardening of national borders. So border militarization and mass incarceration, it's all been part of this, quote, deepening divide between the hypermobile and the friction fixed. What is the historical relationship here between increasing mobility for capital and growing control over the movement of people, whether in prisons or between nation states?
Well, this is something we should all talk about because it differs a lot in different places, certainly. And as we've already been indicating in a variety of ways in the things that Brenna and Alberto and I have been talking about, it's not as though what we see working is some kind of mechanistic, functional system in which the economic imperative then produces a certain output. It's not a machine, though it feels like a machine sometimes because it's so big and noisy. So the movement of capital, which has gotten freer and freer and freer, and the relative immobility of labor in the North American context, which is, say, US, Canada, and Mexico, so it's not all of North America, but most of it, has been in part a way to make it possible for the capitalist firms that pass their goods through these three countries to sort of maximize what they can extract from workers. I mean, that's clearly what NAFTA was about. And I forget what the new name of what used to be called NAFTA is. Seems still to be about that. Now, if we step out of the United States for a moment and think about other places that are also characterized by remarkable inequality, we can say, well, we see that in India, a large, vast, complicated political economy, urban, rural, manufacturing, not, and so forth, that people, on top of the many other conflicts and contradictions, people from Assam have been officially relegated to second-class status. And many of the people from Assam travel to other states of India in order to work in agriculture and so on and so forth, waterfront and so forth. Dominican Republic has diminished the citizenship status of people who are the descendants of Haitians. Now, this is one island. And so Haitian Dominicans are second-class citizens in the Dominican Republic. The UK has been deporting people many places, but particularly to Jamaica, as well as elsewhere, in their constant purges. To do what, though? Is it to secure the labor force they want? Is it to secure a certain kind of provisional legitimacy as the rapacious capitalist firms suck money and resources through the state, so from people's pockets through the state into their coffers, whether in the UK case to run private prisons or to do the test and trace apps and the other things through which cronies of the current UK government have amassed billions and billions and billions of pounds of revenue? Is it, in South Africa, where the high levels of and underemployment, the sort of constant movement of people closer to where money wages can be earned means that the cities have grown way more rapidly than the cities have had the capacity to build and provide infrastructure and services, and the self-built communities around Durban, around Cape Town, around Joburg, and elsewhere have become sites of self-organization, but also struggle with very intense policing and a lot of fights as well. At the same time that I'm told by people whose analysis I trust, the level of xenophobic violence in South Africa is rising again because basically the cost of bread is rising again. So in the US, anti-immigrant, in India, anti-immigrant, in South Africa, anti-immigrant, in Brazil, there's a lot of struggle around the same kinds of issues. And all of these places, and the UK, famously with Brexit, all of these places have deep inequality and have pretty high levels of mass incarceration, although nobody is remotely close in terms of rate, remotely close to the United States.
Do you see a connection between, on the one hand, the declining legitimacy of the global economic order and the liberal internationalist world order that we've seen in recent years, on the one hand, and this increasingly intense debate over the prison industrial complex and immigration, when for such a long time, mass incarceration and immigration control, alongside neoliberal globalization, I'm particularly thinking of the 90s, all of these three things, mass incarceration, immigration control, neoliberal globalization, were really taken to be almost natural norms. Not that they weren't criticized by some, but is there a relation between some sort of legitimacy crisis for all three of these things?
I mean, one of the things that's a real challenge in order to get to grips with the legitimacy crisis you mentioned, Daniel, and the particular way in which it's articulated by movements of the so-called populist or indeed radical right or far right, is in a way that classic issue of the link between racism, racialization, and forms of exploitation and forms of capitalism, right? I remember reading a few years ago Peter Fryer's book, Staying Power, A History of Black People in Britain. And it has 3 chapters on riots. And 2 of them concern returning white English soldiers from World War I and World War II who were previously employed as dock workers and whose dock work had been supplemented by workers from, broadly speaking, the Commonwealth who had either migrated for those jobs or shifted from other jobs to those, including actually, if I'm not mistaken, in Liverpool, a large proportion of Yemenis, in Bristol, other groups as well. And then there's a chapter, of course, about the Notting Hill riots in the 50s, right? Which, of course, are on the racialization of housing and of the structure and the nature of urban space. If we take, so that, gives us a sense, right, of how mutable also the points of condensation for far-right mobilization are. Indeed, it was the Dockers, some of the Dockers, of course, I'm not besmirching the entire category, but it was a group of Dockers who came out in defense of Enoch Powell, right, after the Rivers of Blood speech in the late 60s as well. And what we see, though, I think in the present, just thinking about the UK, which I found, both galling as one lived through it, but, also really striking, was the way in which the politics that drove the removal of the capacity to labor, the removal of the right to labor within, the British polity from, let's say, Bulgarian and Polish and Romanian workers as the primary, if not by any means the sole target of this wave, which also included in a complex articulation the attack on the whole so-called Windrush generation, that was perceived by many as a very peculiar and actually in a very quotidian sense as a very peculiarly irrational operation, because it was driven by sort of tabloid British jobs for British workers, a phrase that Alas Gordon Brown also pronounced at one point, which when those Bulgarian and Romanian workers were removed or left of their own accord because the situation was so miserable and dire and devoid of horizons, were not replaced by those famous British workers. It wasn't the Tommies returning to work on the docks, right, and having a struggle over this racialized working site. It was very much a kind of superstructural, in many ways, fantasy also about the nature of what work and class mean in Britain. So I think that was very striking, as was, and feel the need to mention it, at least in this forum, the bewildering failure of vast ways of people of so-called progressive opinion to not look at people's passports when they did their class analysis, which became a reflex for so many, right? So all of those cliches, right, about working class voter rebellions and so on and so forth, were very happy to say working class without thinking of who packed their salads and who worked in their fields and who manned the logistical centers and so on and so forth, right? And I think that is, has been a very striking element of also the imaginative geographies and identifications that go along with class that make a lot of these phenomena difficult to talk about and organize around in any even remotely emancipatory sense. And I think in other domains, there have been better, at least slivers of a better politics. I'm thinking, for instance, of some of the strikes around logistical work in Italy, which very much had migrant and non-white workers, completely at the center of them for some time.
I'm gonna start from where Alberto just left off, talking about the logistical strikes and thinking, really hard about the people who during the pandemic were, characterized with applause and pot banging, the essential workers who, at great peril to themselves, went out and did the essential work of bringing us our salads or going to the hospital without adequate PPE to care for people who were sick and dying and suffering. And over the last couple of years, I've been following with great interest many things, not the least of which is the fact that one of the biggest unions in the United States is the National Nurses United. And the nurses are really quite a formidable group of people whose political education over the last 2 years has compelled them to agree to really astonishing, in my view, really remarkable a set of resolutions that they published at their convention this past January. And so they talked about things like what is happening with the circulation of, well, I call it the social wage. What's happened to public budgets over time? What about, I mean, they have demanded nonstop free universal health care for all. They have stepped up in opposition to immigrant control. Many people who work in nursing in the United States are themselves long-distance migrants, probably in most cases with adequate documentation to be able to come and go as they like, but there is a political understanding of the experience of long-distance migration that matters. So it's not just that they're migrants, they have developed a political understanding in the context of struggling face-to-face with suffering people in hospitals. Meanwhile, they, like people who work for Amazon or people who work for Starbucks, work for these incredibly enormous multinational corporations, and yet they are constrained to fight work site by work site by work site. So there is an understanding of the dilemmas of both big capital and, as it were, the kind of neoliberal imperatives that have been, forcing down wages and disrupting the sort of close relations that, in some cases, smaller firms might have had with the communities where people live and work, right? So there is this abstract enemy called Hospital Corporation of America. There is this constant movement through this kind of Dakota space between Philippines and the United States, or Liberia and the United States, or Sierra Leone in the United States, or Jamaica in the United States, at the places which are one of the homes. I don't ever purport to know what home means to anybody, and multiple homes for working people are not all that uncommon. But wherever home is, obviously there's some kind of disruption, unstable or not, that has compelled the movement of people from Liberia, Sierra Leone, Jamaica, Philippines, to the United States or to the Gulf or wherever they work to work and send remittances home. The fact of remittances then gives another, more insight. So all of these dynamics that the nurses, or at least their political education formation, have been thinking about, enable the possibility for people to think internationalism from the ground up. And I could say a lot more about that, but I want to give one other example, and that is, again, from ground up, the work that for now 38, almost 40 years, the MST has been doing in Brazil. So land occupations, establishment of villages, establishment of schools, so on and so forth, as well as sending teams out around the world to work with people, including in the self-built communities of South Africa and in Indonesia and wherever, to work with people to figure out how to make whatever soil and agricultural capacity they have flourish. There's also an entire urban dimension of late that the MST has been involved in, not only struggling around food insecurity or food apartheid or nutritional insecurity, whatever you want to call it, in the cities of Brazil, both the very overbuilt as well as the self-built hillside favelas, but also in solidarity with long-distance migrants who pass through Brazil, heading very often to the United States and Canada, who are vulnerable to being entrapped by the various police forces of the countries they'll pass through, who have contracts with the United States to prevent people's movements. I mean, there's all of this going on. So if that adds up to a legitimacy crisis for neoliberalism, I'll say, yeah, I applaud that view, and I think it's incumbent on us to think as closely as we can about the various really spectacular events of the last couple of years. I mean, not only that the US cities all went up in flames for a while, but also events like that incredible general strike in India, where, 250 million people put their tools down, which tells us there's all this other organizing going on, because that doesn't happen spontaneously, right? So I think there is some significant legitimacy crisis. I think that the forces of organized violence for the overdeveloped world are very busy positioning their troops around the world, whether it's in Somalia or somewhere closer and closer to the Ukraine border. The questions of what sovereignty means are fundamental to what we're trying to figure out. And yet, I don't feel the kind of overwhelming despair that some of the things I write about might seem to suggest I should feel. Because everything I write is in order for us to figure out how to organize.
When I was thinking about your question or statement you put to Ruthie about legitimacy crisis of something like neoliberalism or mass incarceration, I thought, well, you're kind of asserting it as though it's self-evident, that there is a legitimacy crisis. And so after listening to what Ruthie just said, I guess it's something that I'd like to think further about, because from where I'm sitting, it doesn't feel like there is a legitimacy crisis exactly. And that, given the moment that we're in with a climate crisis and a climate emergency, you would think that there would be a much more virulent legitimacy crisis when it comes to neoliberalism, mass incarceration, et cetera, everything else you mentioned. But that's just not, I don't know, it's just not what it looks like from where I'm sitting. And when we think about questions of sovereignty, of course, I'm sitting in British Columbia, I'm sitting on Musqueam land right now, and the struggles in this place are really ones of assertions of different jurisdiction, right? They're assertions of Indigenous jurisdiction over their lands, coming up against a state capital nexus and a legal apparatus that insists on reducing these jurisdictional confrontations and battles down to real estate matters and property disputes. So there's a way in which I think, and I guess, the other place from where I'm sitting is as a legal scholar. So in thinking about the legal structures that, underlie neoliberalism, or if we think about neoliberal legality, I think what I see is actually a system or systems that make it, in terms of how they operate, it is much more difficult in this moment to actually identify points of opposition, which is something, Ruthie was talking about earlier, I think. If we think about the way that neoliberal legality operates as both being parasitic on the kinds of liberal legalism that we're all now very, accustomed to critiquing, and we can see the points of opposition and we can deconstruct them in our sleep and all of that. Neoliberal legality operates in a very different way, I think, to make it extremely, extremely difficult to find a point of real, genuine opposition. And when I say that, to give a more concrete example of what I mean, if we think about financialization and housing, the way that neoliberalism operates in terms of labor, which is to going back to the idea of the extraction of time, but in a very different way than the incarcerated. But, neoliberal relations of work have made it extremely difficult for people even to find the time to organize. I mean, this is something very different from the world that I was familiar with as a young person, right? Where I could see how older people or, people who were organizer, even if I think 20 years ago, what time felt like in terms of just all of the basic elements of reproducing one's life and the people who you live with, right? Like those basic elements of social reproduction. I think that, neoliberalism and certainly the legal apparatus that gives it a material life has created a situation where it is the whole idea of the legitimacy crisis, I think, is then also needs to be, I think, reframed or rethought then. Sort of where do we see modes of resistance and confrontation that are adequate to the way that neoliberalism works? I think this is, a big question.
I think we see this one-time very naturalized, normalized bipartisan politics behind neoliberalism, mass incarceration, border enforcement breaking down not only because of declining legitimacy in the eyes of a radicalizing left, but also in the eyes of a radicalizing right. But I agree that we're not at really a full crisis point, but instead some really long-running interregnum where it seems like everyone has lost faith, but people are nowhere angry or organized enough to make a change, a massive systemic change, either for better or, in the case of the right's disillusionment, for very much for the worse.
I wonder, though, if we could, in a sense, divide or multiply even the notion of crisis of legitimacy, right? I mean, partly, riffing off of what Brenna was saying about living somewhere where the very legitimacy of the state has never been recognized by the people whose lands were taken and occupied. And we can, in a sense, extend that also to think of vast swathes of social life where people never felt that domination over them or the extraction of portions of their wages and work and so on had, or whether state or and its minions had any particular legitimacy. I'm thinking there's some great passages I remember from these letters that the Italian communist Antonetta Maciocchi was sending to Althusser as he was in the depths of silent depression during May 68. And she was campaigning in Naples in the so-called sub-proletarian neighborhoods of Naples. And she writes wonderfully about the completely both ironic and distant and instrumental relationship that all of the Neapolitans she was talking to had with legality as such and with the state, which were at best things to be tolerated, perhaps things to be undermined or things to be manipulated if need be, or to be negotiated with either monetarily or otherwise, but who were never actually interpolated as citizen subjects. That just was not the game they were in. And so I wonder, right, for whom has there been legitimacy and for whom has it entered into crisis, and how? For a resurgent or intensified and recombining radical and far right, certainly in settler colonial contexts, which have their very specific forms of fascisation, it is, to go back to terms that both Brenna and Ruthie have raised, it is a matter of a re-empowering of a racialized form of petty sovereignty. Constitutional sheriffs movements in the States, these bizarre forms of dual power that leverage the Republican Party for extremely militarized but also kind of dual biopower forms of local politics, right? Where they're also, building ramps for disabled people and, et cetera. Or, in the Italian case, you have these, patriotic occupations done by far right groups who, take over apartment buildings in Rome for, people with Italian passports who are unemployed, but who also, go out and attack migrants. They have very different relationships to legitimacy. So I think in some ways seeing it, I think there's a risk that's obviously necessary of seeing the crisis of legitimacy through the lens of a kind of electoral disaffection or a disaffiliation with the systems of representation, which I think is extremely significant and needs to be thought about and dealt with. But I think there's other layers, and there's also an asymmetry, whether the one who is looking for a legitimacy that's lost is nostalgic for a legitimacy that they imagined existed for people like them, and who want to reinvigorate or reenact it in some sense, and whether instead that crisis is experienced by people who never necessarily felt themselves to be the people who the state was interpolating as citizens, but who perhaps had a less violent and less exclusionary, less depressing relationship to those state institutions in the past than they did now, or found room to breathe and live in a way that now is becoming more, for various reasons, less the case. So I do think it's not to say that the notion of a legitimacy crisis and of the kind of interregnum you mentioned, Daniel, is not useful or pertinent, because I very much think it is. But I think we need to kind of really divide that notion of legitimacy and think about how and if it's experienced and lived in people's lives.
I mean, we can also see it in the U.S., not just in terms of representative political institutions, but also, of course, in the workplace at Starbucks and Amazon, to name two inspiring examples.
In the U.S., of course, we have lived through the reconfiguration of the territorial extent of all kinds of remedies for perceived diminution of rights. And that's a wordy way of saying that however much the federal state of the U.S. sort of generalized, as it were, a territorially expansive protection of vulnerable people, that is going away. It's going away very deliberately. And the people in the state legislators and their governors and so forth, who are sort of seeing this fragmentation of the territory of rights, if you will, are doing it because they, of course, embraced the notion of a legitimacy crisis and have organized themselves and have acted to reconfigure the world in a way that they brings back or brings ahead the world according to the rules that they think should be in place. I mean, this is what Laura Ingraham says. All right. So, but I want to say a little more about this and connect it to what Brenna was talking about concerning how many people in Canada and in unceded lands and around the planet, in the context of contestation over the control and use, the usufruct of land, are persistently invited to embrace the notion that the way to resolve that dilemma is for, as Brenna said, for land to become private property. So this is happening where you're at, it's happening in Jamaica, it's happening all over the place. It's not happening evenly, but it's certainly happening. And one of the effects, I think, of this particular kind of incorporation of people who imagine themselves to be contesting dispossession, that their incorporation then strengthens rather than weakens what we're calling neoliberalism, although 90% of the time, I'm not really sure what I mean when I say the word. Part of this kind of incorporation, in my view, kind of appeals to people's notion of themselves as beings who bear culture with them. So whether we are bearing our indigenous culture, and if we can have this land as property, then we can perform our culture. And I don't mean do a dance for an audience, I mean be. And that this appeal to culture also, I think, helps us understand the various dimensions of how the strong executive, and I really mean the iron fist executive, is so much presented as the remedy for problems that one imagines in a democratic setting would be slugged out in democratic assemblies. So I'm going to give an example, which is going to sound far from the example of the privatization of unceded land in where Brenna's at. But in the city of New York, there's been an ongoing crisis over the city jails. So famously, Rikers Island, which has been the penal colony for many decades, has been roundly condemned politically. People die there all the time and so forth. The former mayor of New York proposed building 4 new jails, dotting them around the boroughs, and spending $11 billion of borrowed money to build these things so that the jails could somehow fulfill the promise of actual enlightened correction. And of course, we abolitionists have been against this. Well, there's a new round of activity in the city of New York now around the issue of where and under what conditions a new jail for, quote, women and gender expansive people, unquote, should be and how it should be run. All right, so far so good. You can see this landscape I've laid out in the city of New York. Well, the people who have proposed the elaboration of this new jail, different from the 4 new jails that the former mayor had proposed, say our jail is not really going to be a jail. The perimeter will be secured by cops, by correction officers, but the people inside who work there will not be prison employees. It's going to be run by a not-for-profit. But in order to achieve this spectacularly wonderful new lockup for women and gender expansive people, the city of New York, which is one of the most densely unionized public formations in the United States, is going to have to break the union contract with the prison guards. Now, in order for the city of New York to break the contract with the prison guards, necessarily a new body, decision-making body, has got to slide into the already existing complexity of a city that's composed of 5 different counties, and above those 5 different counties, be able to hire, reprimand, and fire anybody, right? So we'll have the strongest imaginable executive who will then lift the problem of prison well-being and prison rehabilitation for women and gender expansive people out of the realm of politics and keep it in the realm of, quote, culture. This is the word they keep using, culture, that's then put into motion by technocrats. In the context of everything that we've been talking about, I think we can see in this story of what is being debated right now in the city of New York, both neoliberal legitimacy crisis and a neoliberal resolution to the legitimacy crisis. Both things at once. And as Olufemi Taiwo says in his new book, Elite Capture, of course, There are, countless people who are pushed to the front of the stage in every discussion who once upon a time were locked in the hellhole that is Rikers, who say, yes, I want this new prison. And we never explore the question, why do you expect that you or anybody should go back to prison? Like, that's not even on an agenda of possibility any more than I think in the case that Brenna was talking about, that there is any possibility, seriously discussed possibility for actual land back rather than privatizing some bits of unceded territory in the part of North America where you're at.
I'm Aziz Rana, and you're listening to The Dig, a great place for analysis about where we are, how we got here, and what can be done. It's my favorite podcast, and you can support it at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by University of California Press, which has loads of great titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Democracy's Chief Executive, Interpreting the Constitution and Defining the Future of the Presidency, by Peter M. Shane. In the eyes of modern-day presidentialists, the United States Constitution's vesting of executive power means today what it meant in 1787. For them, what it meant in 1787 was the creation of a largely unilateral presidency, and, in their view, a unilateral presidency still best serves our national interest. Democracy's chief executive challenges each of these premises while showing how their influence on constitutional interpretation for more than 40 years has set the stage for a presidency ripe for authoritarianism. Offering instead a fresh approach to balancing presidential powers, Peter M. Shane develops an interpretive model of adaptive constitutionalism, rooted in the values of deliberative democracy. Democracy's Chief Executive, Interpreting the Constitution and Defining the Future of the Presidency, by Peter M. Shane. Out now from University of California Press. Ruthie, you write, quote, "The key point is this. At any scale, racism is not a lagging indicator, an anachronistic drag on an otherwise achievable social equality guaranteed by the impersonal freedom of expanding markets. History is not a long march from pre-modern racism to postmodern pluralism. Rather, racism's changing same does triple duty. Claims of natural or cultural incommensurability secure conditions for reproducing economic inequalities, which then validate theories of extra economic hierarchical difference." And then elsewhere you write, quote, "The state's management of racial categories is analogous to the management of highways or ports or telecommunication. Racist ideological and material practices are infrastructure that needs to be updated, upgraded, and modernized periodically. This is what is meant by racialization. And the state itself, not just interests or forces external to the state, is built and enhanced through these practices. Sometimes these practices result in protecting certain racial groups, and other times they result in sacrificing them." This notion of racism as a changing same reminded me of a few things. First, of Joe Lowndes and Daniel Martinez-Hosang's work in their book "Producers, Parasites, Patriots," when they point in particular to how frameworks conventionally used developed to stigmatize Black women welfare recipients as parasitic on the productive taxpayer, how in the Tea Party era that was redeployed against unionized public employees. And it also made me think about Trump's growing support from Black and from Latino and even Black voters in 2020. Anyone can take this one first. How do you see racism and racial formations mutating today, and to what end do they appear to be mutating?
Well, one example that many people talk about in the context not only of the U.S., but also Western Europe, is the quote-unquote racialization of Muslims, who themselves might check, if they live in a place that has categories to check, which many people don't, might check any range of more old-fashioned racial and ethnic identifiers. So that is an example. It's not the only one. Also, certainly, and Alberto and Brenna, you lived through this and probably thought about it a lot. In the build up to Brexit, it was pretty striking, as I've learned from my friend Ben Rogali and others, how, for example, Polish workers were, constantly harassed more and more and more as the date for Brexit drew near by all kinds of people saying, at last, you're going to leave and go home. And I say that just to sort of underscore, once again, that race and color are not an identity, and even national origin.
I mean, I think there's many different ways of answering that question, most certainly. But a couple of things come to mind for me, and it relates back to several of the themes we've talked about. And one is the idea of the petty sovereign and how racial violence is currently playing out. So I wanted to add to the framework that Ruthie elaborated when she was discussing that proliferation of police organizing and that kind of police work. The framework of settler colonialism, to think about how historically, for sure, but also in the current moment. So I think this is something that has maintained a very important place in the formation of settler colonial states, is the figure of the petty sovereign, who is not the typical figure person we associate with that term, the police, the administrator, etc., the jail keeper, the bailiff. It's actually, citizens who fall into a long-established kind of racial kinship with the sovereign state. And settler violence has always relied on the blurring of that line between, the police who have the monopoly of violence and then the petty sovereign citizen subject who doesn't have a monopoly of violence, but is certainly enabled by the state to enact all kinds of lethal racial violence. So we can think about, how that's manifesting in this particular moment in the context of rising authoritarianism, white nationalism. I think that there were elements of that in the Freedom Convoy, the so-called Freedom Convoy in Canada that lasted several months, or the Clown Voy, as people referred to it, maybe very disparagingly, but, where we saw the police in Ottawa almost give their blessing. When you listen to the interviews with some of the police and they were talking about the convoy protesters, it was as if they were talking about their kin, like their sons or their cousins. There was this kind of implicit understanding. Now, I'm generalizing, of course, but that was definitely present. And I think about, how forms of racialization are changing in other contexts. So in terms of the petty sovereign figure, that also comes to mind in the context of Israel-Palestine, where all of the settlement, much of the settlement activity and displacement and dispossession happening also happens through the figure of the petty sovereign, who is not a member of the military or the police state, right? These are private petty sovereigns, you could say, maybe. And I think of Palestine because I also think about how racialization and anti-Palestinian or anti-Arab racism is manifesting itself today, where there's a mutating form, we could say perhaps, where, racialized people who are not necessarily Palestinian face a particular form of racism because of their support for Palestinian rights. Now how do we think about that form of racism in this current moment? And maybe there is a legitimacy crisis when it comes to Israel's apartheid practices, and that is why we see this as a response to that. I don't know, maybe that's something to think about. But, Yeah, I think that the mutating forms of racism and racialization do provide an example of where they mutate in response to a kind of crisis often, and I think that these examples I've talked about are instances where there is a crisis that, in the Canadian context has been produced by the pandemic, and also, of course, the recent rise in at least the discourse or the rhetoric of reconciliation around Indigenous rights and not just Indigenous rights, but Indigenous sovereignty. And then in the Israel-Palestine context, you also see more recently a growing global consensus that the state of Israel is engaging in apartheid practices, with mainstream human rights organizations finally backing up what Palestinians and others have been saying for decades. And that is producing a virulent reaction, which incorporates particular processes of racialization, namely one example is what I just mentioned. So those are some of the thoughts that are provoked by your question.
What about the strange situation, and this is for anyone, what about the strange situation where people that we certainly think of as racialized, like Hispanics in the lower Rio Grande Valley, are swinging hard to the right? Not only swinging hard to the right politically, but really seeing themselves reflected in MAGA America?
The first answer to your question, Daniel, is to think really hard about that phrase you use, see as racialized. That the dynamics are perhaps far less direct and predictable than we who have gotten into the habit of speaking in collective generalizations for good reason tend to present and represent. The race and racial capitalism isn't an epiphenomenon, and yet it's still a fiction. And people take to the streets, right, because of real effects. But that means they take to the streets in order to undo real effects, in order to embrace some other possible effects in their lives. And so it kind of doesn't surprise me to think, people in the Rio Grande Valley who all kinds of folks might have assumed would cast their electoral ballots on the side of greater opportunity and protection for quote unquote people of color didn't do it. Any less than that so many people of African descent in the United States see that their path and their household and community's path to well-being and security is to become cops. Like, they know all the stories about cops. They know all of them. They become cops. I mean, I don't see that is any more surprising than people in the Rio Grande Valley voting for Trump.
Eric Adams got beat up by cops as a teenager.
That made him like a cop. It's like the categories. I think that the reason that many people kind of stub their analytical toe on racial capitalism is that they think that the categories must be fixed, rather than thinking that the whole genius of capitalism is that it changes all the time, and that racial is part of this changing. I mean, can't have capitalism without people, cannot have capitalism without inequality, cannot have capitalism without constantly the system, wherever it is, at whatever scale, going into crisis, which means we cannot have capitalism without capitalism saving capitalism from capitalism. And it's in that dynamic that we see these things these relationships, these identities, these assertions, these ascriptions emerge, consolidate, perhaps fracture again. Some of us have been talking just recently, kind of in a desultory way, about how terrific it would be if the sort of huge anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, anti-imperial category political blackness came back into being, right? And coming back into being would mean it would have to have meaning to go forward into being, right? There isn't any return. And the kinds of fragmentation and sort of categorical fixity that so many people, especially in the US context, sort of project from our eyes and our understanding onto people in their, kind of messy common sense is probably what's in the way of such an all-embracing category to start moving as the kind of specter of our time. But it seems to me there ought to be something that can do the work of suturing categories so that they become, so that the possibility of solidarity, which we can see if we look, the possibility of solidarity rather than alliance becomes more meaningful to people as they look around trying to understand what's going on in the world.
Yeah, it takes us back to that concept of changing. Same, if race is the constant apologia for that changing capitalist systems, changing forms of inequality, then we shouldn't be so surprised that race and racism are always changing too, and that if we are going to make major political economic change, that's going to require articulating new forms of identity as well.
Right, in the context of fighting capitalism. I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's not one or the other. If it's not both, it's nothing, I think.
Alberto?
Well, maybe just to go back to what the two, not examples, but kind of cases that Ruthie was talking about just at the beginning of her answer, namely the racialization of, to use an improper term, phenotypically white Europeans and the question of Islam. Recently, I was, as part of trying to write this book on the contemporary afterlives of fascism, reading against some of Cedric Robinson's work, and actually the way in which the optic of racial capitalism is employed by him to counter what he sees as these, as he nicely puts it, manicured genealogies of fascism produced by Western intellectuals throughout the 20th century. And he actually very strikingly says, well, there are two distinct, he says, and concealed cultural articulations that lie behind modern racism. And one is the intra-European and therefore retroactively, but totally anachronistically intra-white articulation of conquest, dispossession, and depredation along racialized tribal or group axes. And the other one is the encounter with Islam, right? Or the Europe's encounter with its kind of Islamic other. And that becomes those two elements, which are, I think it would be obviously very methodologically inaccurate to say they have a return in any direct sense. But it's striking, right? That those are seen as the matricial bases for racial capitalism that is not born in the transatlantic slave trade, right? Contrary to what bizarrely a lot of people still think that Cedric Robinson said, but I'll leave that aside. And also, I think maybe to go back to the point that you raised earlier, citing Ruthie regarding the material and infrastructural character of the work that race does and the constant repair of its failing infrastructure, or the need to kind of recombine it. In that same passage, Robinson speaks of racial discourses are there to normalize the abundant and frequently destabilized systems of domination and subordination, right? And so in one sense, it's the destabilization and the various vectors of destabilization that need to be attended to, both analytically and, militantly or prescriptively, or however you want to talk about it, to think through these questions that you've raised so pertinently, and that Brenna and Ruthie have already discussed.
Abolition is sometimes heralded as this position of intransience. It is the stubborn insistence that the entirety of the prison industrial complex and the whole social order that requires it, that it's beyond reform or repair. As you write in the book, such an insight, quote, makes people impatient, as it well should. And yet, the sort of struggles and demands that your organizing has advanced and that you celebrate throughout the book, it's not the stuff of immediate total rupture with prisons and police. And what's more, the capacious picture of abolition that you paint for us seems to move at a slower pace than a single revolutionary event or some sort of decree that prisons and police batons shall all be traded in for plowshares. How should we relate this abolitionist maximalism to the longer arc of social transformation that it might require? And what does that mean? And this is something I think you've written about, Alberto. What does that mean for how we think about what revolution means?
That's a great question. I was just reading China Melville's new book on the Communist Manifesto, and he actually takes up a debate that a couple of those Western Marxists, Perry Anderson and what's his name, All That Is Solid, Marshall Berman, had about what a revolution is. And of course, Perry says a revolution is a very specific thing. It's a change of a government from below. Otherwise, it's just a metaphor. And then the discussion ensued. Well, here's what I think. I think that if living life for the purpose of changing how we live life takes a long time, so be it. The kinds of problems that we who think a lot about abolition and try our best to explain its kind of universal remit tried to show is that there are certain kinds of changes that just kind of reorganize what already is, like resolving problems of unceded territory with privatization of property, or electing police officers to preside over the capital of capitalism in New York. And that the longue durée is not the purpose, but it ought not be surprising at all. Just as it took, it's taken, we're all here looking at each other because of stuff that started happening in more or less 1451, right? So it's not as though we're stuck in a series of events and reconfigurations of recent occurrence that we must quickly and swiftly undo. Now, further, anybody who imagines that the forces of organized violence in the United States or Western Europe or a good deal of the country could be toppled tomorrow if only abolitionists were more impatient would have to show me their plan of action, because I don't think that can happen either. And yet, making the world that we want, which people are doing in so many different ways, brings together, I think, kind of at least two pretty powerful strands of human self-organization. Well, let's say three. Human self-organization and activity from the last couple of centuries at least. One of those strands is communism, small c, and sometimes the small c is realized through big C, communist parties. One of them is the kind of serious anarchism that, produces really strong and vibrant self-organized communities. And the third, I'm going to say, perhaps unpopularly, are the liberation faith movements of a wide variety of types. So not necessarily monotheistic, but not monotheistic either. But that these strands just keep coming together and forming the possibility for things like, to go back to my favorite example of recent years, the MST to do what it does. That, to me, is what abolition should be. It's a normative claim. That abolition isn't a party. It's a way of thinking about the world that then gives us the ability to see what people already do and figure out how to make more of that happen.
I mean, I guess there's a kind of historical irony of sorts, because the language that most people on the left take as a source of their vocabulary to talk about revolution was, of course, not just forged at the time when abolitionism, calling itself abolitionism and calling itself not gradualist but immediatist abolitionism was so critical, right, to scholar activists of the mid-19th century. Marx, writing for the New York Daily Tribune, has one of his articles where he basically just uses the article to reproduce a speech by Wendell Phillips on the liberation of enslaved people in the West Indies, for instance. Even more so, all of these often tiresome scholastic debates about Marx and Hegel are rather quickly resolved once one sees that Marx uses a term from Hegel, which is generally given kind of conservative or conservationist or reconciling notion, Aufhebung, which is the same term, that and another term, Abschaffung, that are used to talk about the abolition of slavery. And Marx links that directly to the abolition of private property and the abolition of all sorts of other interlinked institutions. And of course, he and all sorts of myriad activists and thinkers from all wings of what was, international, working people's movements, etc., face these very issues for, 100 and some more years, right? The question, that you pose is also that the question that was the practical question of transition, right? What do we do with our banks? What do we do with our highways? Or indeed, very significantly, what do we do with an entire material world that has been generated by, is reproduced by, and enhances the devastation of our planet through fossil fuel consumption and all of the social relations that accrue to them, right? The form of the problem you just raised about prisons is not disanalogous from the form that we pose about other dimensions of contemporary capitalist society. Of course, those dimensions have different materialities and different temporalities and are also interlinking and interlocked with each other in all sorts of ways. But the problem, I think, still remains not just that of what we intend by revolution within this kind of network of ideas and experiences and histories, but also going back to the example that Ruthie raised regarding the prison building in New York at the moment, the question of exactly what those non-reformist reforms would look like, right? And already in that formulation by Undergortz in the late 50s, those non-reformist reforms are not just judged by their consequences or by how they fit into a broader strategy. They're judged by the fact that the people concerned are directly, in a collective or mass sense, involved in them, right? So I think that's also really, really crucial, that we don't take a view that just simply what would count as revolutionary in terms of its effects without thinking about those problems of the transformation of everyday life and experience that goes along with it, and the making of the kind of collectives that can engage in the revolutionary or communist or abolitionist politics. And I think the ways in which solidarity, is mapped out in the very concrete, seemingly local but actually internationalist struggles that Ruthie's looking at in a number of passages and articles in the book are really kind of exemplary to think with, right? About what would it look like, right? What it would look like for seemingly fragmented, seemingly disparate people to come together in determinate places, right? To engage in processes of dismantling that are processes of building something else, right?
You just said that my question really interestingly, that about the immediacy of abolitionist demands and the long delay and slow pace of the struggle that it raises, that it reflects or echoes these fundamental longstanding questions about the transition to communism. And relatedly, I'm thinking one might be forgiven for thinking that abolition might be another way to talk about communism.
Totally. Without a doubt. You can use that for the intro to the podcast.
So, quick follow-up on that. Then why abolition? Why not just communism?
Well, I didn't dream it up. But why not just communism? Given that so many of the people who came together to quite energetically in the 90s to launch this aspect of the contemporary abolition movement came out of communist formations. It was always right there. And I imagine, and I've never really, talked with my comrades about it, but I imagine one reason it was that we already knew, and I've actually written about this a bit in one or more books, we already knew that many people are really deaf to the word communism. And then I forget who said it. Was it Bolivar who said anti-communism without communists? Somebody or other. But anyway, that anti-communism, continues to be so lively in the United States, and many people who, as was the case in the past, would rapidly embrace all of the aspects of communism they might learn about if somebody told them all this stuff without using the C word, are not unlike, I think, many people today. Although I do have hope that younger folks are quite enthusiastically becoming curious about what communism is. So those are a couple of the whys, that people turn a deaf ear, and that people think they know what this thing is, and think, therefore, if they listen, think, therefore, that they should stop listening because this thing is not what they want.
I just accept that when Ruthie mentioned the date 1451, it just made me think that yes, but also in other places, like here, I feel like British Columbia only became a province. So this is the province that's at the extreme end of extractivism, of a kind of terra nullius version of settler colonialism, and is also experiencing climate change at an exacerbated extreme rate. So that's, another thing that is happening here, that it actually only became a province and joined Confederation in 1871 and sort of formed as a province maybe 10 years before that. So there's also sometimes a feeling, as we acknowledge that we're on unceded land, and by doing that, we call into question very explicitly the legitimacy of colonial sovereignty and the private property relations and everything that flows from that. Maybe it's old, but there are also, these moments happening where there's a possibility of unsettling. And that is only happening now because of that long arc of struggle and resistance. And so I find thinking about abolition really helpful and generative because it holds these different temporalities together. And I think that that's absolutely vital in terms of trying to think about how change happens and how we make change. I'm not thinking as something as like lofty as revolution, but just transformation, like radical transformation, let's say, to get away from the Perry Anderson baggage of thinking about revolution, I think that's one aspect of thinking through the concept of abolition and the practices of abolition. Again, it holds together different temporalities, and it also holds together the conceptual and the more abstract with really the daily lived practicalities, the not practicalities, but the everyday, and that kind of organizing that is totally unglamorous and tedious and difficult and involves a lot of, communicating with one another and, all of that kind of work. So, it's a capacious political idea and practice that is, really incredibly generative.
Well, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Alberto Toscano, and Brenna Bhandar, thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks for having us.
Yes, thanks a lot.
Brenna Bhandar lives and works as a law professor on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples and is the author of Colonial Lives of Property, Law, Land, and Racial Regimes of Ownership. Alberto Toscano teaches at Simon Fraser University and is the co-director of the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought at Goldsmiths at the University of London. He is the author of multiple books, including Fanaticism, on the Uses of an Idea, and is co-editor of the Sage Handbook of Marxism. Ruth Wilson Gilmore organizes with people around the planet, teaches at the City University of New York Graduate Center, and is the author of Abolition Geography, edited by Brenna and Alberto, Golden Gulag, and out this fall, Change Everything. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that the political state represents the table of contents of man's practical conflicts. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis and recorded at WBRU in Providence. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Tamuz Frankel and Mariel Solomon. Our senior advisor is Thea Riofrancos. A very big thanks to Ben Mabey and Mia Inoue for their help in prepping for this interview. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. If it's on iTunes, please also leave us a nice review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really and truly does that is you telling people they should listen to the show. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.